So, I love villains. I think a good villain is crucial in the making of a good story. They are often the most entertaining characters that you will see on screen. They are also the ones that usually have the most growth over the course of the story. They are also the ones who get the redemption arcs. And when they're written really well, they're often the characters that have the biggest potential to be the most human because they're complex, like most humans are. First things first, what is a villain? And what is the current state of villains in Genshin Impact? According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, the definition of a villain can be a character in a story who opposes the hero, a deliberate scoundrel or criminal, or one blamed for a particular evil. It's different from an antagonist. An antagonist is someone whose role is in opposition to the protagonist. The biggest difference is that an antagonist is not always evil. The simplest example is that in a romantic love triangle, the rival of the protagonist is considered an antagonist. They're not an evil person, but they are in opposition to the protagonist. Villains, however, are usually characters that are evil. A villain is almost always an antagonist, but an antagonist isn't always a villain. With that established, how do we apply this to Genshin Impact? Before we start the video, as always, disclaimer, I'm not a professional video essayist. I'm just here to talk about games and mostly whatever I want. So the things that I say are my opinions. You're free to disagree and just don't take them too seriously, like it's Genshin Impact. Let's not be too serious here, okay? So since we've established what the definition of an antagonist and villains are, we can start naming the antagonists of Genshin since we do have quite a few. We have most obviously the Abyss Order, we have the Fatui, we have the Five Sinners of Khaenri'ah, the Academia, and soon probably we will have the Heavenly Principles. At one point, A was an antagonist of the story. So which out of the ones that we just listed down are actually villains and not just antagonists? We can determine villains by looking at their motivations. I know the concept of morality isn't black and white and often comes in shades of gray, but for the sake of this video, we're going to define evil into these traits. I will consider the character evil if they are 1. Consciously causing pain and suffering to others, showing cruelty, etc. 2. They feel no remorse for their actions. 3. They take pleasure in harming others. I will try to acknowledge the shades of gray when it comes to talking about character behavior, but these criterias are what I believe to at least capture what we as a society consider an evil person. With that in mind, I think we can already think of a few characters that more or less exhibit these traits in Genshin. 5 years into the game, we're now pretty deep into Genshin's main story. We are familiar with most of the Harbingers at this point. We've even met a few Sinners of Khaenri'ah, and I have to say the portrayal of villains in Genshin is a bit weird. And since we've barely met anyone from the Abyss Order other than Enjo and the Twin, as you've already seen in the title and thumbnail of this video, today we will mostly focus on the Fatui, the Harbingers specifically, because I just have a lot of stuff to say about them and they're the most developed group of antagonists. Being the massive weeb that I am, I cannot tell you how much I love the Fatui Harbingers. I've always liked the idea of an organization with a hierarchy of elite soldiers, and this shot of them in the trailer just reminds me of the Espada from Bleach, if anyone has watched that show in their childhood like I did. So I was always invested in the Fatui from day one. From the moment Signora and Child showed up way back in patch 1.0, I was extremely excited at the thought of meeting the rest of the Harbingers as we progress through the story. And I've mentioned this before, but I specifically remember the moment A Winter's Night Lazo dropped. Like, I remember the exact moment that trailer came out and what I was doing at the time. If you remember that particular moment in your life as well, let me know, like, what were you doing when that trailer dropped, because it broke the Genshin fandom. For me, I was actually having lunch and people around me were just like confused as to why I was freaking out. But anyway, it was safe to say that a lot of people were extremely hyped for the Harbingers and the Saritsa. Fast forward a few years and now we've met like what, 8 out of the 11 Fatui Harbingers? And we've even met the top 3 Harbingers if you exclude the Jester, since he's technically the director of the Fatui, so we've met the top 3. And while the morality of the Fatui can be debated and it is vague, some of the Harbingers are morally gray, some are villains, like some are just like pure evil, come on, let's be real. But what is not vague about the Fatui, like the organization in general, is the destruction that it has caused all over Teyvat. And it's always been that way since the beginning, like since the early days of Mondstadt and Liyue. The Fatui were always supposed to be an antagonistic or even villainous group. The Harbingers might be more diverse as people, but the organization itself, they're pretty darn shady. And from what I've seen online, it seems seems like the reception towards the Fatui nowadays has been a bit mixed, is one way to put it. Some are still big fans and love the characters that we meet over time, but some have been a little bit disappointed with how the more recent characters and harbingers are portrayed. Personally, for me, I think the portrayal of the Fatui has been inconsistent, specifically some of the harbingers. As time went on, it became more clear that the harbingers were never meant to just be a group of evil villains. They were just a group of people all serving the Tsaritsa for different reasons, and some have clashed with the Traveler, hence they became antagonists to the story. Although it is important to acknowledge that in the beginning, the Fatui were always portrayed as unapologetic villains. They were causing trouble everywhere they went. They were evil. People were always wary of the Fatui. I would say that this is the case for when they introduced Signora, Child, Scaramouche, and Dottore. Signora didn't show much remorse for harming others. She had no qualms or issues in stirring chaos both in Liyue and Inazuma. She doesn't seem to hesitate to try and kill the Traveler or others if it means that she can achieve her goal. She was a villain through and through, and the game genuinely let her become a villain in the story. While the Archon Quest didn't explore her backstory at all, the Crimson Witch of Flames and Pale Flame artifact sets does give us insight on her backstory and how she became someone so cruel. And then she dies before we even had the chance to explore the more complicated sides of her character. However, it is commonly believed that Signora was allowed to be an unapologetic villain because she was never gonna be playable in the first place. Hence, the game doesn't need her to be marketable. And if that is the case, then that would mean every harbinger that's playable will be treated differently from Signora. In other words, the game would have to soften the other harbingers in order for them to be likable and marketable so that people would want to pull for them. And I think that fear is what we've seen kind of happening with the more recent harbingers, especially since some of them are playable. Do I personally believe that? Kind of. I'm not saying that all of the harbingers should be evil, but I do see the attempts of trying to soften some of the more rough characters, but we'll get into that. Back to the older harbingers, like the first one that we've met. In fact, even back in the day, we got Child really early on in the game. He's allowed to be a villain, and he's the main antagonist and villain in the Liyue Archon quest. Yet he's playable and is beloved by a lot of people. He's very popular. Of course, some people really dislike him and his decisions to, almost drown lots of people. But I think a lot of players appreciate him for just being a very complicated character. It's also important to remember that the Fatui Harbingers are made up of different people with different goals. Most of them are self-serving, and not even just the Harbingers, like the Fatui as a collective can commit acts one would consider evil and show absolutely no remorse. Inside the organization, you still find individuals who aren't necessarily evil. Like, some are with the Fatui purely for the resources, some are because of pure circumstance. But the problem is, in my opinion, the game hasn't really been able to show that complexity really well. While the game has been able to make interesting characters in concept, especially like the Harbingers as antagonists or as villains, they haven't always been successful in making them good villains or antagonists or even interesting characters. Some just miss the mark completely, and some are kind of inconsistent. Since the first 4 harbingers that the game introduced to the players have ranged from cruel to pure evil, this can set up certain expectations on what the harbingers as a collective should be like. I think the expectations of the harbingers being evil and then seeing them being not evil is what causes some players to be disappointed with their recent portrayal. At least that's a part of it. So it's part inconsistency and it's part expectations. To me, the problem was never about how the Fatui isn't evil anymore. It's always been in the portrayal, because even if they are evil, like pure evil, treating them without nuance will also give us just another flat and unmemorable character. Kind of like the Grand Sage, he's there to act as a comically evil guy without complexity whatsoever, and he's kind of forgettable as a character. You just remember him as the bad guy of Sumeru who screwed over Nahida, but not as anything else. The Harbingers are supposed to be majorly important characters, so at the very least, they should be memorable and interesting. They need to be good characters first in order to be good villains. Which begs the question, what makes a good villain then? And have the Harbingers fallen from grace as the game's villains? I think there are a lot of answers out there, but for me personally, what makes a good character character and a good villain? Well, one, they need to have a point in the story and drive the plot forward. Their actions actually have to have impact. Two, they need to be able to challenge the ideals of the protagonist. Not just to oppose it, but to challenge it in a way that drives growth. Three, their actions need to make sense from their perspective. And for this to happen for the players, they need to be well developed as characters. Hence why, in my opinion, villains like the Grand Sage aren't really good villains. They're there to create conflict for the group of protagonists, in this case the cast of Sumeru, but he himself as a character doesn't really offer anything else. But he's an NPC, so who cares, right? But to Genshin's credit, they've actually changed their approach a bit in recent Archon quests with Rarier, but this video is not about Rarier or the 5 Sinners, so maybe another time. In my opinion, the Fatui Harbingers are mostly characters first, villains second, which is the right approach. So far, Signora and Dotori are both the only Harbingers that are mostly pure evil with very little redeeming qualities, and even if they have the potential to be complex characters, currently it's left unexplored. Signora is already dead and Dotori hasn't had that chance yet. The other Harbingers that we've met are a bit more complicated though, and that's because they're playable characters. One of the biggest problems with the inconsistencies in the Harbingers for me personally is how Genshin has this tendency to want their playable characters to be at least likable or friendly towards the traveler. I guess they're just convinced that if a character is kind of nasty towards the traveler, they wouldn't want to pull for them because some people see themselves as the traveler. I don't know. It is very possible. Like, some people do not like Scaramouche for this very reason. But I think the need to make all playable characters friendly with the traveler is a pitfall for inconsistency, especially when you're trying to write a morally gray group of villains who are vastly different from one another. So let's talk about the Harbingers that are playable. There's Child, Scaramouche, Arlecchino, and soon Columbina, and they're all very different from one another. Child is portrayed as someone who is very unhinged. He seems normal on the surface, he has hobbies, he loves his family, he likes to cook, but he's also someone who's constantly gets into trouble. He will do almost anything to get a good fight. He doesn't really seem to show remorse when he hurts others too, especially when it's in a fight. The Fatui is a very shady organization. They are very capable of evil acts, and Child seems to have no problem in carrying out orders as long as he gets a good fight and he can further the Saritsa's vision, which is also something he seems to believe in. While all of the Harbingers follow the Saritsa's orders, not all of them actually care about her goal, and Child seems to be one of the few that does care. So Child, in my opinion, is actually a character that has the making of a good villain. He's decently established as a character. I mean, we know a few things about him through his character story and through the Archon quest. We know that he's pretty chill, but he's also very dedicated to his job and can make very morally questionable decisions. We also see how ruthless he is when it comes to getting what he wants or needs. We see this more unhinged side of him in the Archon quest, and through his story quest, we see a completely different side of him. We meet his little brother, and we see Child trying to maintain his little brother's innocence, going as far as pretending he works for a toy company and going into foul legacy mode, risking his own well-being just so that he doesn't break his brother's fantasy. I have seen some people argue that Child protecting his little brother from the truth will harm him and possibly their relationship in the future because, you know, he's lying to Tusser. But because the traveler has a sibling, they can actually relate to Child in wanting to protect their family from the ugliness of the world. This tells me that Child isn't unaware that his job and what he does is very shady to an extent. If he didn't, then he wouldn't have felt the need to hide his actual job and affiliations to the Fatui. He also learned from his character story that he fell into the abyss as a child, and he was never the same after that experience. So from those two quests, we can kind of get an idea of what motivates Child as a character. He wants to provide for his family like a normal guy, but he's also someone who carries darkness in him. He's implied to have this almost uncontrollable bloodlust, not for killing, but he would throw himself into a fight just for the thrill. In the Archon quest, we actually see him say that he doesn't like killing innocent people. Him unleashing Osile was a last resort. The immoral act being shown here here is his decision to gamble thousands of innocent lives just to bait out Zhongli, who might not even show up, by the way. And all of that was just so he could retrieve a gnosis. His relationship with the Traveler is also kinda interesting. They're pretty friendly with each other. Child treats the Traveler almost like a friend slash rival, while the Traveler just kinda tolerates Child. They're a bit distrusting of Child, which is justifiable, but in the eyes of the Traveler, Child, as shady as he is, isn't a complete monster like some of the other Harbingers. A Harbinger that the Traveler used to hate is Scaramouche. The Traveler first meets Scaramouche in patch 1.1 in an event called Unreconciled Stars, and I gotta say, the Traveler's hatred towards Scaramouche after that initial meeting is completely justified. He tried to kill the Traveler not once, but twice. And the next time we see Scaramouche in Inazuma, he's also not exactly pleasant to the Traveler. Scaramouche then becomes the main antagonist in the Sumeru Archon quest. After running off from the Fatui with the Electronosis, he is now working together with Dotori and the Grand Sage in order to create a false god and replace Nahida as an Archon. We also learn more about his origins and what motivates him as a character. Scaramouche is a puppet created by A to hold the Gnosis, and A deemed him too emotional or weak to hold the Gnosis, hence she left him to sleep in the Shake Pavilion until he was found by the people of Tatarasuna. And unbeknownst to Scaramouche himself, every tragedy that befalls him and the people of Tatarasuna was caused by Dotori. Scaramouche had 3 big betrayals. The first was A abandoning him, and the second was the Tatarasuna tragedy and the whole thing with Niwa, and the third was the nameless child who died due to illness. And all of that caused him to turn on humans, and he became the broken, bitter, and most importantly, vengeful man that we met in patch 1.1. Now, Scaramouche was evil. I don't care if you like the Wanderer and his design, but he was evil. I like him as a character. Hell, I liked him enough to make a 1-hour video about him, but he was a Harbinger that was undoubtedly evil. He wasn't one note because the game actually spent a lot of time in developing understanding on why he acted the way he did. His destruction is driven by pain, but it is destruction nonetheless. In case you forgot, Scaramouche destroyed the Raiden Gokaden, aka Bladesmiths in Inazuma, due to his hatred towards Niwa, even though most of the people that he killed had nothing to do with what happened in Tatarasuna, and Niwa himself turned out to be, innocent. He's also quite abusive towards his subordinates in the Fatui, like he would hit them. He clearly doesn't value human lives because he has grown to hate humans. But the interesting thing about Scaramouche is that Genshin gave him so much time to develop as a character. I think he's one of the very few characters that's actually developed across patches and across different regions. He was introduced in 1.1. He was the main antagonist in Sumeru and had his own interlude quest dedicated to exploring his backstory and also to the start of his redemption arc. And he's back again in some events and forming new friendships with Albedo and Durin. And now he's back in the Not Cry Archon quest where he's trying to get his revenge for what Dotori did to him. So in other words, he's now seeking closure. What's interesting is that he's not inflicting pain on others this time around. It seems like now that he has proper support from Nahida and newfound friendships with Albedo and Durin, and also structure in his life in the academia, he's been able to deal and process his anger in a much healthier way than before. I think the potential moral dilemma that he will face is that, is he willing to throw away everything that he has worked for, the new life that he's built, just so that he could get revenge on the one man who took everything from him? And I really hope the game explores that, because that would actually make his arc very interesting. His relationship with the Traveler has also changed. They used to hate each other, but now the Traveler treats him like he would any other acquaintance and potential friend. The Traveler is, after all, a direct witness to his growth as a person. The Traveler knows the truth behind his past. They also know all of the atrocities that he's committed, and he's also seeing how the Wanderer is slowly growing as a person. Scaramouche, now the Wanderer, is still an ass sometimes, but he's starting to take steps toward redemption. He's actively choosing to do good and to help others. Like, he's building his own life instead of destroying others. He's not fully redeemed, but he's taken the steps. Now, I think Scaramouche / the Wanderer's portrayal as a villain is actually really good. We know why he is the way he is, and the exploration of his past wasn't really to generate sympathy or automatically redeem him because he was evil. The purpose of that is to help the Traveler and the players understand him. There was really no big attempt in making him softer as a a character so that he would be more likable. The Traveler actually didn't like Scaramouche for a very long time, and that actually makes sense for both of their characters. It would just be very strange if the Traveler is like all buddy-buddy with him just because he decided to make some changes in his life. But after some follow-through, I can see a friendship forming. It would make sense. Hence why seeing the Traveler slowly trusting him now and having more friendly interactions with him feels a lot more natural. And his friendship with Albedo and Durin also feels a lot more natural because we've actually seen the Wanderer go through so much growth. What can I say? I think the game did a really good job in handling Scaramouche / the Wanderer as a character and as a villain. I obviously don't have the sales data on the Wanderer, and I do know some people do not like him because he's an ass, but I wonder if the decision to not make him softer as a character impacted sales. I don't think so. I think he's pretty popular. If he's not popular, he wouldn't be like showing up every other event like he is now. But I don't know, what do you guys think? Arlecchino, on the other hand, before you come at me, I do really like her as a character. I think she's incredibly fascinating, and she was this looming presence throughout Fontaine. She isn't in the spotlight for most of the story, but she does pull a lot of strings from behind the scenes. Linny, Lynette, and Fremine act based on her orders. In the Archon quest, she showed that she was ruthless. She had no problems in attempting murder to obtain Furina's gnosis, but it's also shown how she's actually very calculating. Once she sensed that Furina had no divinity within her, she immediately showed mercy. She could have just killed Furina for the sake of it, but she didn't because it no longer served her goal. During the Fontaine Archon quest, we also see that Arlecchino's motives are actually kind of selfless. She wants to save Fontaine because of her own feelings of attachment to the nation. She herself grew up in Fontaine and she didn't want to see the nation drown, so she did everything that she could to help out. This gave her and the Traveler a shared goal. The Traveler is understandably very distrusting of Arlecchino or anything related to the Fatui. In the Fontaine Archon quest, the Traveler was so distrusting of the Fatui that they were very angry at Linny and Lynette when they learned they had kept their affiliations with the Fatui a secret. Now granted, the Traveler was trying to defend Linny in a murder trial, so it's understandable that they would be pissed that Linny omitted crucial information that ended up being used against them by Furina. But yeah, so that's the Archon quest. In her own story quest, we also learn a lot about her backstory. We learned that she herself was an orphan that grew up in the House of the Hearth, and she grew up with a much crueler mother. The character Mother is the previous Harbinger before Arlecchino killed her and took her place in the Fatui. And this is interesting to me because the existence of Mother actually acts almost like a measurement for how evil Arlecchino is. Arlecchino as a person so far is shown to be ruthless and doesn't really mind committing acts of cruelty or disregarding human life in order to serve her goals. But because Mother was introduced in her story quest, it shows the players that Arlecchino is actually not that bad compared to this other character. This isn't a bad thing. It shows that Arlecchino, even though she's a Harbinger, as cruel as she can be, isn't someone who enjoys inflicting pain like Mother did. She can commit acts of evil, but she doesn't harm others for pleasure or amusement. She sees shady Fatui work as just something she has to do to meet a goal. She also kills for a purpose. She wanted to kill Crusabina or Mother because she and her friend Clarvy were the only two orphans who recognized Mother's actions as, actual abuse. She was making children fight to the death, Hunger Games style, and they recognized this as evil, as they should. Despite her own wishes to kill Mother, her friend actually didn't want her to kill Mother directly and insisted on escaping the House of the Hearth until they both eventually lost hope, and their story tragically ends with Arlecchino ended up being forced to kill her only friend, and after that, she finally killed Mother. I also haven't mentioned that Arlecchino is a descendant of the Crimson Moon dynasty, the Kandrian dynasty that Rhaegar was tasked with killing. Hence, it makes sense that she was able to overpower a Fatui Harbinger and take her place even though she was so young. As Father, she's obviously not as cruel as Mother, but she still punishes betrayal with death. In my opinion, just because she's less cruel than her predecessor, it doesn't automatically mean that what she's doing is good or that she's a good person. She's not. She's cold and calculating, but she is presented as a more human character with her own trauma that shaped her. She also doesn't like Dottore, especially because of his cruel nature that's similar to Crusabina. She even said that she would have him killed if he weren't a Harbinger in her own voice lines. She's really intimidating too, hence why I hope that she will stay intimidating and not be soft softened just because she's now playable. But anyway, more on that later. Another thing I want to highlight about Arlecchino is that as a Fatui Harbinger, she seems to be able to meet most people's expectations of who she is as a character. I think it's natural for us as players to have certain expectations when it comes to characters, especially ones that are highly anticipated like the Harbingers. As established, the 4 or 5 Harbingers that we meet are all troubled or unhinged or even evil, even when they are complex characters. And this can set up a lot of expectations on the ones that we haven't met yet. And on top of that, the voice lines of characters like the Wanderer and Child talking about other Harbingers also set up certain expectations on how those characters would behave. For example, for the longest time, the Wanderer has described Arlecchino as a wolf in sheep's clothing, and voice lines have always been treated as a source of accurate information for the players. The bias or unreliable viewpoints of these characters are often forgotten or disregarded altogether. Some characters having a skewed perception of others is actually something I like. We as humans see others differently depending on our own values and upbringing. Some people always want to see and believe in the bad, while some people are more gracious with how they see other people. And for the Harbingers, it shouldn't be surprising that they all have a very inaccurate perception of each other, and players in turn can also have a skewed perception because of this. But the point of the Harbingers, in my interpretation at least, was never in being an evil group of people. They're armed and shady for sure, but the Harbingers aren't there under one vision of being evil. I'm saying this because there's absolutely nothing wrong with making some Harbingers completely different from people's expectations. After all, they're there for different reasons. For example, I think not a lot of people expected the captain to be so noble in his decisions. He was from Condria, and despite serving the Syriza and being the first of the Fatui Harbingers, his goal was never about glory or even anything self-serving. In fact, he had one of the most selfless goals out of the group. I think the captain was an interesting antagonist in the Natlan Archon quest for a while, specifically because he challenged Mawika's approach and even tried to use violence in his opposition. Their goals were the same, but their approach was very different. But then he just kind of caved after like a few conversations, and that was always my biggest disappointment when it comes to the captain. And then he comes back to the story to drop his lore, and then he sacrificed himself for the greater good and so that Mawika doesn't have to die. More than anything, I think he had the potential to be a more fleshed out and more memorable character or antagonist, especially as the first of the Fatui Harbingers before they offed him. But hey, here's hoping that he does come back one day, and maybe with Signora too. So that's one Harbinger that comes to mind when talking about not meeting expectations. Another Harbinger that comes to mind for me when talking about this is Columbina. And again, calm down before you attack me. I personally like Columbina, but I think a lot of people, myself included, had a certain perception and expectation of what Columbina would be like as a character. And this was mostly because of Scaramouche and Child's voice lines about her. They both said that she's terrifying, and before Not Cry, we've only seen her humming eerily at Signora's funeral. But as of recently, she's been the center of the Not Cry Archon quest, and she has been anything but menacing. She's the reincarnation of the Frost Moon goddess, and she's portrayed as someone who's aloof, like she would mostly give you vague answers before staring off into the distance. She is actually the one who is in need of the traveler's help, so she's not even an antagonist in the story. She was recruited into the Fatui as a power source for the Syriza or something, and she stayed because she really had nowhere else to go. Hence, her main goal was to go back to the moon, to go home, because she is growing weaker and weaker in Teyvat anyway. This makes her a sympathetic character more than anything. I can understand why some people are disappointed with this. I think some people wanted to see this creepy, seemingly delicate girl hiding a dark secret inside. But personally for me, I like this version of her just fine. It's different from what I expected, sure, but I still find her interesting, and I think they spent a good enough time with her at this point that we actually have a pretty good understanding of her personality and her motivations as a character. Even if she's not an antagonist and a villain, Columbina was never dispatched on missions, so the entire time she was in Teyvat, she's also just used for her powers both by the Frost Moon Scions and the Fatui. People expected her to do things, but she's never felt like she belonged anywhere, hence why she eventually left the Fatui, and then she eventually ended up in Not Cry. It's also said that the Syriza used up most of Columbina's powers. It's not disclosed yet what it was used for, and as of the writing of this video, Columbina's story isn't over yet, but it is safe to say that she's not a villain. She's just someone who happens to have ties to a sinister organization. However, I do have some disappointments, and my main disappointment from Columbina's story is how little being a harbinger actually affects her story and her as a character. You can tell me that she's a prisoner of the abyss and they used up all of her powers, and it wouldn't really change her as a character that much. Columbina was the third of the Fatui Harbingers. I just wish that time that she spent in the Fatui had more lasting impact on her as a character. It's like her role as a harbinger meant nothing. It offered nothing to the story other than she was drained of her powers. And that's more on the Tsaritsa than it is her as a harbinger. But anyway, her dynamic with the other harbingers are interesting, so there's that. It's interesting to see someone so aloof interact with people who are unhinged, like Arlecchino and Sandrone. I think the harbingers being so different from one another is what makes them so interesting. Another harbinger that I also wish had spent more time with the Fatui is actually the captain. I think my disappointment in him as a character is similar to Columbina's, and it's in how his identity as a harbinger wasn't really explored. His story was just mostly about his curse of immortality and his platoon in Natlan, which, don't get me wrong, it's still an interesting story, but I also wished we knew a lot more on why he was made the first of the Fatui Harbingers. He has the strength and also the determination of what you would expect the strongest harbinger would have, but he was given so little screen time that he's not really as memorable as the other harbingers. A harbinger that actually feels like a threat, has a big presence in the story, and is extremely memorable is Dottore, and he's a rank below the captain. Dottore is memorable because he's probably the most clear-cut evil harbinger that we have as of now. He absolutely has no problem inflicting harm on others, and he takes pleasure in it too. Everything he does is in the name of research. He wants to create a god or elevate humans to the level of gods, and he has taken some extreme measures in the pursuit of his goals. He's introduced as early as the Genshin webtoon and was officially in the game when the traveler meets him in Sumeru. He's the one helping the Academia and Scaramouche in creating the false god to replace Nahida. He was also the one who messed with Scaramouche, caused instability in Inazuma, killed Niwa in cold blood, and then framing him, causing Scaramouche to go on a rampage. He also then modified Scaramouche to unlock his power. Dottore also made clones of himself, like actual Horcruxes of himself. Under Dottore's guidance, there were also experiments on the treatment of Elazar, and the victims of this experiment, one of them was Kale, by the way, had to go through a painful and traumatic experience related to god remains. He also experiments on the children from the House of the Hearth given by Mother, like her rejects. He's also kinda implied to be involved with the death of Diluc's father, and most recently he's shown interest in Kuvaki and has tried to kidnap Columbina. He has created chaos in almost every nation in the game. His presence is just felt all over Teyvat. Nothing is off limits when it comes to his research. He's cruel, calculating, and so far pure evil. There's really nothing that they could introduce to the story that would make Dottore not evil. Like, you can't even introduce a Crusabina type of character to soften his image. No tragic backstory can save him at this point. He's meant to be pure evil, and I'm personally okay with that. While I hope he gets more development as a character, I genuinely hope the game doesn't try to redeem him in any way or make him likable to the traveler. Please, anything but that. But anyway, he feels more memorable and important as a villain or the big bad of the story. It's not because he's more evil than the captain, who, if you really think about it, isn't really even evil at all. He's a better villain and character purely because of his impact on the story. Like I said, his presence is felt in almost every part of Teyvat, and his actions have had direct impact on multiple important characters and the traveler. Meanwhile, I can't really say the same for the captain. To put it a bit harshly, to me it feels like he's almost reduced to a plot device to save Mahuika, and he's supposed to be stronger than Dottore. It's such a missed potential. The captain essentially had very little impact to the story, to the traveler. He didn't really challenge the traveler in any way that encouraged growth, or even in Mahuika, they had clashing ideals, but he just caved with Mahuika's wishes. This problem isn't exclusive to the captain though. Like, if the heavenly principles or the rest of the five sinners are given the same treatment, they will also feel like they're wasted potential. Like, imagine if Vedofalnir, who's supposed to be this visionary and Dainslav's brother, only got like 30 minutes of screen time with none of his actions really ever being felt by other characters or the story or the traveler, he would also feel like an underwhelming villain. Now, this particular point is just something I wanted to address because I did see some people discussing how differently the game treats female harbingers versus male harbingers. The discussion that I saw was the male harbingers seemed like they were allowed to be complex and how the game allowed them to push moral boundaries. As we've just discussed, we have the Torre, Scaramouche, and Child, all of them unhinged and have some evil within them. And with the recent introduction of Colombina and Sandrone, and also some softer moments with Arlecchino, some players can't help but to point out the difference in how these harbingers are treated. Now, this is my personal opinion. I don't mind male and female harbingers being treated differently if they are supposed to be different characters by default. Like, for example, Colombina has never been a violent or evil character. She was never meant to be a villain. She's only implied to be scary. So when she's actually just a gentle moon goddess, I don't find a problem with that. She was never supposed to be unhinged. Sandrone too, like we knew very little of her prior to Not Cry, but while she seems to be a bit unhinged and has a short temper, in the Archon quest at least, she's been pretty helpful. She's friends with Colombina, and even though she can be unpleasant and, let's face it, a textbook tsundere, Colombina likes her and Colombina can see right through her mask. They have a pretty fun dynamic. And Sandrone is in the Fatui because of her research, because that's probably all she cares about. She's described by other harbingers to have a terrible personality, and that's not completely inaccurate. However, it is implied that she can be very cruel. This happened in a world quest, specifically in the questioning Melusine and answering machine quest in Fontaine. A displeased Sandrone had someone's spine broken and tongue cut off for it to be replaced by an apology letter. This is probably one of the crueler things I've seen in the game, and I don't mind this being a part of her character. I don't think Sandrone being kind to Colombina automatically softens her as a character. It just means that she values the life of some people more than others, but I do hope that the game doesn't disregard this very cruel side of her so that she's more likable and is more marketable for players if she does end up being playable. I think that's what bothers some players and me personally, when villains are softened so they're more marketable even though it doesn't make sense for them as characters. I'm not saying that this is the case or will be the case for Sandrone, but it is a slippery slope. Now, Arlecchino is unhinged. She's cold and calculating in Fontaine. She's very comfortable with murder, and the game has acknowledged this multiple times. They have been very upfront about how she's rough around the edges and how lethal she can be, but it seems like now she feels trusting and close enough to the Traveler to call them a true friend. Now, the Traveler did spend some time with Arlecchino in her story quest, but I feel like that's not enough time to make me believe that a character like Arlecchino would consider the Traveler a true friend. I feel like Child and the Traveler are barely friends, and Child has a more naturally warm personality, and he spent a lot more time with the Traveler too. I don't mind the funny moments that the Archon quest had with Arlecchino, like her being fascinated by cat ears because it reminded her of her children. I think that's kind of funny. Trying to humanize a character and trying to soften them can be very different. For example, Scaramouche being referred to as Hat Guy by Nahida is supposed to be comic relief. It's supposed to add a sense of lightness to his character that's supposed to be very edgy and kind of dark. But if Scaramouche had made remarks about being friends with anyone, not just the Traveler, too early, it would have felt out of place. Which is what I felt with Arlecchino. It's like they're trying to soften her as a character as opposed to just humanizing her and showing that she can still care for her children and have an amusing moment while still making sense for her as a character. This might be fanon or my own interpretation of her as a character, but I find it hard to believe that she can consider someone a true friend so quickly, especially when she had to kill the last true friend that she had. And living the way that she does, being a descendant of the Crimson Moon dynasty, I just find it strange that she trusted the Traveler so quickly. I just always saw her as someone who only trusted her children and no one else. But hey, maybe you have a different opinion. But anyway, I don't think there's really any difference in the way the Harbingers are portrayed based on their gender. I just think that Scaramouche in particular had so much development and screen time that he can come off as a villain that's actually complex, and the way he softened to other characters also felt natural because of it. The female Harbingers haven't had the chance to do this yet because most of them are more recently introduced. The captain had the potential to be a complex and extremely interesting antagonist or even villain, but he never got to do that too. It's all in the writing and the intentions behind it, not the gender. If the writers of the game have the patience to build complex and nuanced characters, then the Harbingers won't feel like they're softened, just so that they would feel more marketable to the players. I just hope that Hoyo realizes making a character that's rough around the edges doesn't mean they won't sell. Like, Arlecchino is always going to sell and be popular as a Harbinger regardless of how she acts to the Traveler. So what is the point of this video? I'm just always looking for an excuse to talk about the Harbingers. They are such an interesting group of characters to follow. I do believe that them being a villainous group or an evil group was never really the point. Some of them are evil, they can commit evil acts as a means to an end, but the Harbingers specifically have always been set up to be a melting pot of misfits from across Teyvat and beyond. Some are unhinged, some are there by circumstance, some are there purely for self-interest and resources. So I never expected the Harbingers to be all villains. I did expect most to be antagonists though, at the very least. So to answer my own useless question, as usual, I don't think there's been a fall from grace for the Harbingers as villains. There's just been some missed potential and some expectations that weren't met. Honestly, that's not exclusive to the Harbingers. Even Archons go through this. But how the Harbingers will be remembered as antagonists and as individual characters will continue to depend on Hoyo's willingness to let them be characters first, marketable products second, or else we'll continue to have awkward moments where cold calculated characters seem too friendly or suddenly too soft, or where their actions just don't make sense for them as characters. So that's all I have to say for my deconstruction of the Harbingers. I hope you had fun listening to me ramble about the Harbingers. I'm excited to see more of them in the story as we progress through Snezhnaya. We are getting Snezhnaya next. So that means we will get to meet the Tsaritsa soon, and I'm just excited to see where the Fatui storyline is going. If I do everything right, this video should be posted right before New Year's. So happy New Year to everyone. I hope you guys had a great holiday season, and I hope that you guys will have a wonderful 2026. I personally cannot wait to end 2025. It's been a rough year for me. Like, a lot in my personal life has been very difficult, work has been difficult, and that has translated to my lack of uploads because I have just had no energy to do anything. So here's hoping that 2026 will just be a better year for all of us. I just miss talking about video games, about Genshin. I've been thinking about trying out Wuthering Waves because I don't know, why not? It seems fun. Let me know if you guys think I should try it. But yeah, that's all I have to say. Thank you so much for staying this long. Please consider subscribing if you haven't. If you don't want to, that's also okay. But it would mean so much to me if you did. And I'll see you in the next one and in 2026.